If you are following current events, then you probably hear about the tension between China and Taiwan all the time. It seems like a pretty recent problem stemming from the Chinese Civil War and the Cold War. But the truth is that the two have been dealing with this issue for a lot longer than most people think. You see, China didn't even care about Taiwan for most of its history. Today, it's seen as an extremely important province, but until recently, it was just a small, far away, and not very impressive island. For most of China's history, the country had bigger fish to fry, so Taiwan wasn't really on their radar. But before we explain why exactly China didn't care about Taiwan for most of its history, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any more videos. The origins of Taiwan. Before China ever considered taking Taiwan, the island was home to many different Austronesian peoples. In fact, the ancestors of modern Taiwanese people likely arrived in Taiwan around 3,000 years ago from what is now southern China. These ancestors spoke languages which are still spoken on the island today, like Taiwanese Hokkien, which is related to the Minnan Chinese dialects. However, these languages would change a lot over the next few thousand years, and by the time mainland Chinese started moving to Taiwan in the 17th century, most of these natives could no longer understand Mandarin or any other Chinese dialect. This is because Austronesian languages and Chinese languages are completely different language isolates. That means that if you speak one, it doesn't help you understand another. So these native Taiwanese people were basically a completely separate ethnic group to the Chinese who would later move there. To be fair, the Chinese didn't know that. At the time, the idea of ancient Austronesians migrating from somewhere else thousands of years ago was beyond the scope of their imagination. So when the Chinese started showing up on the island, they assumed that the natives were either a breakaway group of Han Chinese, maybe from the nearby Fujian province, or they were some sort of aboriginal tribe which had simply never developed. Either way, they weren't seen as particularly important or interesting. The Portuguese come to Taiwan. The first Europeans to discover Taiwan were the Portuguese who came across the island in 1542. They named it Formosa, meaning beautiful island, after the Spanish Ilha Formosa, which itself translates to beautiful island. However, the Portuguese never tried to settle on the island, instead focusing their efforts on nearby Macau. It wasn't until the Dutch came along that attempts were made to actually take control of Taiwan. After seeing the wealth the Portuguese had gained by trading in Asia, the Dutch East India Company wanted to set up a base of operations near the riches of China and Japan. The company realized that while they might not be able to compete with the Portuguese in Macau, they could try to take Taiwan instead. So the Dutch began sending ships to the island to try and claim it. The Dutch knew that the Chinese weren't interested in the island, so they didn't bother telling them about their plans. Instead, they just built an outpost and started using the island to attack the Chinese and Portuguese ships passing through the Taiwan Strait. For a while, this worked out great for the Dutch. But eventually the Chinese decided to get involved. The Chinese started attacking the Dutch ships, passing through the Taiwan Strait and fighting against the Dutch on Taiwan itself. The Dutch were able to fight off these attacks for a while, but eventually they got tired of the hassle and sold the island to the Chinese in 1624. The sale only covered part of the island, leaving the northern part to the Dutch until they left for good in 1662. By this point, the Chinese had grown to like Taiwan and were eager to expand their influence there. The Qing government divided Taiwan into 7 counties, resettled it with Han Chinese, and made it a prefecture of Fujian province. In the early days of Dutch rule, most of the settlers on the island were Chinese who had fled the mainland, so the population already had ties to China. But throughout the 18th century, the population of Taiwan grew significantly due to migration from southern China. Many of these migrants were Hakka Chinese, an ethnic group known for being adventurous and willing to move into dangerous areas. Most of the Hakka Chinese in Taiwan were from the Guangdong and Fujian provinces, and they lived in separate communities from the native Taiwanese people. While the Qing government didn't care too much about Taiwan, they did crack down on the British, who were trying to take control of the island. You see, the British had become aware that the island could be used as a base to attack Chinese shipping. The Chinese had become quite wealthy at this point, after centuries of trade with Europe, so they became a target of pirates. The Chinese government asked the British to put an end to this piracy, but the British were happy to let the pirates use Taiwan as a base, since they benefited from the chaos in the Taiwan Strait. This caused tensions between the Qing government and the British, which eventually led to the First Opium War. During the war, the British attacked Taiwan but failed to capture it. After the war, the Chinese agreed to ban opium in exchange for free trade, but the island remained Chinese. Japan takes Taiwan. For the next few centuries, China kept Taiwan as a prefecture of Fujian until it lost the First Sino-Japanese War. In 1895, the Chinese were defeated by the Japanese, who took control of Taiwan. To this day, many Taiwanese people complain that the Japanese stole their island, and while that isn't technically true, it's understandable why they would think that. The Japanese occupied Taiwan for half a century, and it seemed like they had no intention of giving it back. However, if the Chinese hadn't lost the war, they probably would have given Taiwan back to the Japanese at some point anyway. The thing is, Taiwan was becoming more and more valuable to China's neighbors, and the Qing government couldn't keep up with its defenses. So it wouldn't be surprising if the Qing government traded Taiwan to the Japanese in order to get something else, or just to buy peace. Either way, the Japanese took Taiwan, and this time, they actually tried to be good rulers. You see, the Japanese modernized their empire during the late 19th century, and they wanted to include Taiwan in their new era. So the Japanese invested heavily in the island, building railways, roads, and schools. In addition to that, they encouraged immigration to Taiwan, hoping to increase the population. While they did accomplish many of these goals, things didn't end well for the Japanese. In 1945, Japan surrendered after losing World War II. China was victorious in the war and, according to the terms of surrender, Japan had to return Taiwan to China. However, by this point, China was in the middle of a civil war, and the government was focused on winning the war rather than taking Taiwan back. So they just let Taiwan be independent while they dealt with their problems. The government of the Republic of China, while the island of Taiwan was under Japanese rule, the government of the Republic of China was in exile on the island of Hainan. When the Communist Party won the Chinese Civil War, the government of the Republic of China fled to Taiwan and made it their new home. According to the Constitution, the Republic of China was still ruling all of China, including mainland China. But at this point, it was clear that this wasn't going to change. So the government stopped pushing for the reunification of China and instead focused on turning Taiwan into a democratic state. Over the next few decades, the Republic of China went through a lot of changes. The government abolished the monarchy, transitioned to a democratic system, lifted martial law, and allowed for political parties to form. However, the government always maintained that its goal was to retake mainland China, and that Taiwan was just a temporary stop on the way to reunification. The rise of modern-day China. For the longest time, this reunification never seemed possible. China was communist and Taiwan was capitalist. The two governments couldn't be more opposed to each other, and they spent a lot of time arguing and fighting with each other. However, over the past few decades, things have changed. As China has gotten richer, its people have become more connected to the West. As a result, the Chinese have become more open to democracy and capitalism, and many of them see Taiwan as a place which could potentially serve as a model for the mainland. Meanwhile, the government of Taiwan has started to worry about the mainland getting too powerful and just taking Taiwan by force. Today, the two sides are closer than they have ever been, but there is still a long way to go until they can possibly reunify. Maybe someday the two sides will be able to come together and truly reunite China. But as of right now, that doesn't seem very likely. We hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to leave us a like and subscribe for more content. Thanks for watching.